Okay, welcome everybody, and we are back with the second session of day 2 of Marine Mammal Conservation in India webinar series. And we have with us Dr. Elrica D'Souza. Dr. Elrica D'Souza is one of the few people who have actually dived with dugongs, as Sir also mentioned in the last session. And she has conducted her PhD on ecology of dugongs in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. She is currently working at the Ocean and Coast Program at the Nature Conservation Foundation, Bangalore, and Mysore. And her research interests lie in understanding the interactions between marine mega herbivores and seagrasses. She is specifically looking at these interactions in dugongs and green sea turtles in the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago and the Lakshadweep archipelago, respectively. More recently, she has been researching the biotic and abiotic drivers of change in these habitats. I would say thank you, Elrica, for joining us, and we will be happy. Will be excited. We are very excited to see your presentation and your exemplary research on dugongs in the islands. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Anand. I'll just share my screen. Are you able to see it?
We are able to see it, but your voice is coming a little low. If you can hold the mic closer to your mouth.
Is it better now?
Yeah, it is better now.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Anand has already introduced me. I work with Nature Conservation Foundation, and I've been studying dugongs and seagrasses in Andamans and more recently turtles, green sea turtles as well. And today I'll be talking about the work that we've been doing in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and our approach towards studying the dugongs in these islands, and some of our findings and how we went about, finding out management solutions to protect these animals and their habitats. Okay. 1 second. Unable to change the slide. Hello?
I think, Elrica, you can use your arrows, the down and the up arrows for moving the slides, and the play button, I guess.
Yeah, but for some reason it is just frozen. Sorry about this.
You can exit and again start.
I'll just stop sharing.
Yeah, it's working now. It's working.
Okay. Okay, now it's working. All right. Okay, so I'll start by telling you a bit about seagrasses, and so that, just to give you an idea about what these systems are. And so seagrasses are these small flowering plants. They're like how you have flowering plants on land, that you have flowering plants in the sea as well. And they grow in shallow coastal waters, basically where the sunlight reaches, because like you all know, plants require sunlight to synthesize their food. And they can be like really small. They can have the leaf blades maybe of 1 centimeter, or they can grow really tall, having leaf blades of several meters long. And they grow and spread out and cover large areas, large sandy bottoms in the sea, and they form vast meadows in some areas, even in the Andamans. And they perform very important functions in this system. So just by holding with their root system, they can actually hold on to the sediment and prevent erosion of this sediment, or they help in trapping all these the sediment in the water and keep the waters clear. And their root systems also trap a lot of organic carbon, and hence they're thought to be these huge carbon sinks in the marine environment. And there are several creatures like lots of juvenile fish and other invertebrates, some mollusks. They use these seagrass habitats as nursery grounds. Then the seagrasses are also a source of food for some juvenile fish, and for some larger vertebrates like the turtles and dugongs. In fact, the dugongs almost exclusively feed on seagrasses. So I will talking about dugongs. So most of you may know, I'll just share a video here, that dugongs are these large mega herbivores, and they're vegetarian marine mammals that feed mostly on seagrasses, and they are closely related. They are related to the manatee in the sea, and on land they are related to the elephant. In fact, some of the dugongs, the male dugongs, have these tusks also very similar to the elephant, and they grow to about 6 feet in length, and they can weigh sometimes up to 400 kilos, and they are thought to be moving in herds. So across the world, dugongs are found all the way from the east coast of the east coast of Africa, all around the Persian Gulf to India, and in Southeast Asia, right up to Australia. Okay, and in India, they're found in the Gulf of Kutch, like Anand also said in his earlier talk, in the Gulf of Mannar and the Park Bay region, as well as in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Now, they used to be found also in the Lakshadweep archipelago, but they apparently got hunted down to local extinction over there. Now, one may say that dugongs have such a wide distribution, and then why is it that we are they have been threatened? So what has been found is that globally, it's been known that dugongs are threatened either because of the use of nets, and they collide with boats, or due to hunting in several areas. So dugongs are actually surface to breathe every 5 to 7 minutes, and hence when they get trapped in nets, they cannot surface to breathe, and they end up dying. And sometimes the fast-moving propellers of boats hurt the dugong, and they can somehow end up in killing the animal. And in several areas, their habitats too are threatened, since they are dependent on seagrass habitats. So their habitats are threatened either by boat anchoring, by sedimentation, or by other algae and things like that in these areas. So what makes these dugongs so susceptible to extinction? Now these dugongs are slow breeders, so they breed once in 5 to 7 years, and they give birth to a single calf. They have a long lifespan. They grow to about they can live for about 70 years, and they're almost completely dependent on seagrasses. So because of all of these, and then because of all these existing threats in their to the dugongs and their habitats, these dugongs are threatened. And 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 because of all these reasons, dugongs actually given the highest level of protection in India. It's protected under the Wildlife Protection Act, where it's protected under Schedule 1, which gives it the same conservation status as the tigers in India. So now one may ask, these dugongs are so widely distributed in India. Also, we have it in several areas. So why do we like? What is the importance of this species? So the dugong plays an important role in the ecosystem. So it acts as a gardener. So by its feeding mechanism, its constant feeding, where it uproots seagrasses and then new seagrass grows, it actually gardens these seagrass meadows, maintaining it in a particular level of succession. So what happens is that the seagrasses, I will talk about it a little later, the seagrasses the dugongs prefer are very high in nutrients, and hence dugongs through their feeding, they can actually maintain a meadow with these species, which may also be beneficial for other species that are dependent on seagrasses. Now, because so the dugong needs to be protected because of all these reasons that we have seen. But studying the dugong is not easy at all. One is because, especially in Indian waters, the areas that dugongs occur are mostly areas either that are turbid, where it's very difficult to sight the animal, or they might be areas like in Andaman, which are close to, mangrove areas that are infested by crocodiles, or because the numbers are so low, just sighting an animal is extremely difficult. So what we decided is we'll use several approaches to actually try and study the animal in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So we started off the study by first looking at historical records, because that was our best bet to studying these animals. So we looked at all possible records that were, with various forest departments, with various departments in the islands, with some researchers, and most of these records were basically records of sightings, or mostly strandings and mortality records. And we said, let's just place them, look at what these records are actually saying. So what we found is that most of the animals that were recorded were in the North Andaman and in the Southern Nicobar group of islands, and and from the mortality records, what we found is that most of the mortality was due to entanglement in gill nets, while there was hunting and nets also being some of the causes of mortality. Then with these records actually kind of formed a bit of a basis for us to start our research, because using these records, we also looked at distributions, the past distributions, and eventually we used these to compare changes in distribution. Then we were I would say we were lucky to have these opportunistic observations, where we did make an active effort to go to sites where dugongs had been observed, to see if we would actually be able to see some individuals and observe them in the field. So from these observations, what we found is that dugongs were they were feeding on just a few species of seagrasses. Like I said, these small seagrasses that were low in fiber and high in nutrients, and they were actively avoiding the thicker and larger species. And while feeding, they actually they left behind these distinct feeding trails, and you couldn't mistake this for anything else, because there were these cleared portions where you could see that an animal had fed to that, almost like a lawnmower. And from these opportunistic observations, we were also able to tell the sex of some of the individuals by looking at the distance between the genital and anal opening. And we were able to identify individuals based on these marks on their flippers and on the tail fluke. So I think Anand also mentioned it in his previous talk about how we use it to identify one animal from the other. So these marks actually stay and they don't completely heal or close. So you actually know if you're seeing the animal over and over again. And now with this information, what we did is and another thing, what we also found, that we were able to also record these sounds of dugongs at plate and see. So in this, we can hear these small chirps. They're actually the sounds of dugongs. They're very tiny squeaks. So while the most of it is actually the sound of shrimp, but in between you can hear these squeaks, and we've actually managed to make some of these recordings, and these are actually a very good way of actually looking at dugong presence in the future. So with some of this information that we had from past data and from the observations that we had made, the opportunistic observations, we decided to conduct these archipelago-wide surveys. Just one was to ascertain where dugongs were presently being found across the island archipelago, and to see if there was any changes in these in these areas that were being used by dugongs. And we covered almost 70% of the coastline, looking at mostly sandy bottoms where we could find seagrasses. And within these seagrasses, we were looking for feeding signs. So we actively, did not visit, or we avoided sites with close to mangrove areas just because of the crocodiles in the areas, and sites with rocky bottoms, because the chances of finding seagrass is really low there. So in these sites, we looked for these. We looked for seagrasses, and then we looked for dugong feeding signs to ascertain, ascertain the presence of these animals. So, like I said, it's not easy to sight these animals, and sighting feeding signs is actually looking for finding feeding signs is a sure way to know that an animal has been in this area. And later on, I will also say that some of our studies also show that these feedings signs, they can stay for almost 8 to 10 days, and hence you know that if you see a feeding sign, the dugong has been there in the last week or so. And based on these archipelago-wide surveys, we actually identified several seagrass meadows, and we found that these dugongs had these preferences for seagrass of the genus Halodule and Halophila. And on one or two rare occasions, we did find feeding trails in seagrass meadows with the other species as well. But this was only when the meadows, the nearby meadows, which had these preferred species, were actually destroyed by the cyclone. That's when the dugong used to come and feed in these sites. And the dugongs actively avoided these larger species. The other thing, what we found is that dugongs were actually feeding in seagrass meadows that had continuous stretches of seagrasses. So they avoided avoided patchy seagrasses. I think it's probably due to maximizing gain. So while instead of putting in effort to feed in patchy areas, it makes much more sense to feed in larger stretches. And this is what we found right from North Andaman. We were able to identify sites where there were seagrasses, where we found seagrasses with seagrass meadows with dugong feeding trails. And in some areas, we also actually sighted the animals. So this is what the distribution looks like across North Andaman, Middle Andaman, the Ritchie's archipelago, in South Andaman, in Little Andaman, and in the Nicobar group of islands. Okay, so once we identify these sites, we thought we'll select a few sites from these sites which are easy to access and which are easy to monitor, to see how dugongs are using these sites seasonally or annually. So we took the help of our local friends there. We set up an informant network. So these are basically informant network comprised of some fishermen, some tour boat operators, dive centers, and lots of our friends who some friends living close to the coast. And we selected a few sites. I think we selected about 6 sites, and we thought we'll monitor these sites every month. So what we told these informants, that let us know anytime, every month they would call us and let us know if they sighted an animal. And what we would do is just to ascertain that they were actually seeing the animal. We visited these sites and confirm the presence either by actually seeing the animal or through these feeding signs. So we did this for about 4 years, and what we found is that there were few seagrass meadows that the dugongs were feeding on almost every day throughout the almost every month and throughout the year for several years. For some of them, for all the 4 or 5 years that we monitored these sites, the dugongs were there all those 5 years. So then we asked ourselves that, if we are if the dugongs are feeding so voraciously in these areas, there might be some impact on the seagrasses. So let's look at the impact on the seagrasses. And we did a few experiments underwater. We marked these seagrasses and looked at how fast they were growing. We marked some feeding trails, seen how fast they were recovering. And we looked at the areas of these feeding trails and looked at the biomass of the shoots inside and outside feeding sites. And we found that uh, dugongs consume anything between 5 to 40% of the seagrasses that were being produced. So in areas, say like most of the information that we have about dugongs is from areas like Australia or in the Arabian Gulf, where dugong populations are really large, and there they feed in large herds. So what was known in those areas is that these dugongs feed in these large herds. They spend several days or months in one particular meadow, almost wipe down this meadow, and then move to another feeding ground. So, but here what we were seeing is that because the herbivory pressure was low, the dugongs could actually sustain this kind of feeding of the dugong, and dugongs didn't actually have to move because the seagrasses were recovering really fast, and it could sustain these individuals feeding. Another thing what we've seen is that most of from the informal network is that most of these meadows were being used by just one or two individuals, not more than I think just in one rare instance, we probably seen three individuals using a particular, using some meadows. And so what we found is that probably what was happening is that maybe earlier, maybe several years back, in the archipelago, dugongs must have been moving in herds. I'm sure they were never really large herds because of the kind of seagrasses that Andamans have to sustain these kind of large herds. But even if they were these smaller herds, they would have been moving between meadows. One thing what I forgot to say here is that the other thing what we found is that dugongs were using these clusters of meadows. So isolated meadows were avoided, and only clusters where there were two or three meadows together were actually being used by dugongs. So earlier this would have been the scenario where there were these small herds, and they were actively feeding in these clusters and depleting a particular cluster and then moving on. But over the years, these targeted hunting in these different areas across the archipelago have literally led to these loss of dugongs. And if you actually overlay the map of where you have these have these mortality records and the present distribution, you can actually see these areas where dugongs are absent almost over the archipelago, where there are these one or two individuals feeding. And because the herbivory pressures are so low, they don't actually have to move between meadows. They have enough food in that particular cluster to sustain them. So, so based on these findings, we thought our next approach would be to how can we actually, try and conserve these species, or what are the areas that are, how can we identify areas that are best for conservation. So what we know from our studies is that dugongs had this these species, a particular species, a select species that they were feeding on, and hence they would be selecting areas or seagrass meadows which had a specific species composition. They would be selecting meadows that had a particular level of fragmentation, or rather unfragmented meadows. There would also be meadows that were easily accessible to the dugong. So you have several areas that are inaccessible during high tides, during low tides, or due to the upliftment of the islands from the 2005 2004 earthquake. You have some areas, some seagrass meadows that are now totally inaccessible. So the accessibility of seagrass meadows to a dugong, and how near this a particular seagrass meadow is to other suitable meadows. So like I was talking about these clusters that dugongs are feeding in. So we use these four variables to actually to kind of assess seagrass meadows across the archipelago and look at how suitable every seagrass meadow was as a habitat for dugongs. Then we also, from the threats that we knew from our hunting records and from the threats that we were seeing in our stint in the islands, what we found is that high-speed boats, both all kinds of nets were were detrimental or affected or a threat to the dugongs. Hunting pressure, epiphytic algae. So algae actually reduces the nutrient content in seagrasses, or eventually leads to even die-off of seagrasses. And so does sedimentation, that actually causes burial. So we selected these few variables to actually assess how the threat to the dugong and to the seagrass in every seagrass meadow that we assess. So we did the initial assessment of our of the seagrasses at the start of sometime in 2010 or 11. And at that time we actually were able to identify all of this, and we did the assessment for the suitability and for the threats sometime in 2015 and 16. So every seagrass meadow were assessed through this lens. And what we were able to do is we were able to group every seagrass meadow into two broad categories. So basically we had these high priority sites and we had low priority sites. So I'll explain a bit as to what we did over here. So we categorize these sites. So to categorize a site into either of these, they further had these subcategories where we then recommended a particular management intervention. So I'll explain some of these high priority sites. So basically sites that showed the presence of dugongs, that had a low or that had a high intensity threat to the dugong, but a low intensity threat to the seagrasses, and had very suitable habitats for the dugongs. We classified these threats as we classified these sites as an area where management needs to focus on just addressing the threats to the dugongs. So um, uh, of the 68 meadows that we assessed through this framework, we actually could identify 10 meadows that fell into this category. So in the same way, we had sites where the dugongs were present, where the threats to the dugongs were low, but the threats to seagrasses were high, and the habitats were highly suitable. And in these particular sites, what we are suggesting is that management can focus on reducing just the threats to the seagrass habitats. And there was some, and 6 meadows fell in this category. And there were some meadows that fell into both categories, where you had to reduce both the threats to the dugongs and to the seagrasses. In the same way, there were meadows where the dugongs were present, where the threats to both the dugongs and seagrasses were low, but the habitat was highly suitable. So these areas we're suggesting as being some kind of protected areas. So luckily for us, these meadows, presently the meadows that fall in these category are in protected areas. So this is something that does not need any intervention right now. And then you have meadows where the dugongs are absent, but and the threats to both the dugongs and seagrasses are low, but the habitats are highly suitable. So these kind of sites we are suggesting as areas where they can be potential recovery sites for dugongs in the future, where dugongs may choose to come into some of these sites. Similarly, we have these low priority sites where I think maybe management can first focus on the high priority sites, and then if funds are available and if time is at hand, then you can focus on these sites. So like in these sites, the dugongs are absent in these sites, but there could be a possibility of them coming into these sites in the future. So just to make it, if it's not too clear, just to make it a little more simpler, I have this kind of a sketch. So basically, the high priority sites were in these four categories, where you have areas where which we are saying the protected areas, which are again the threats are low, best habitats for dugongs, and the dugongs are presently using these habitats. Then you have areas where just threats to dugongs are high. You have areas where just threats to seagrasses are high. And then you have these sites where can be potential recovery sites. So we put this all on a map, and we could see that every seagrass meadow fell into these categories, and management can easily can now just pick on any site that they would like to focus their attention on, and then they have the kind of intervention that is needed for that particular site. So this is a kind of approach we use, and then what we're suggesting is that in each of these sites you can start off by first in sites where you need to either reduce threats, or you need to reduce threats, sorry, to the dugong or to the seagrasses. You start off by first increasing awareness about dugongs. So over the years, I have seen the change. Like initially at the start of our work, people were not talking as much about dugongs as they now do, and even the knowledge or information about dugong was much lower. But I've seen it over the years with lots of institutes coming in talking about dugongs, the forest department also making their efforts to spreading the awareness, and also just when we've been in the islands, this curiosity of people to know why we are there, what we are doing. That itself has led to a lot. All these three together have led to an increased awareness about dugongs in the island. So, but this still needs to increase, and these are one of the things that can be focused on, and I think is presently being done, is to increase this awareness about the dugongs. Then in areas so and you know tell people to, or you kind of ask people to report sightings of animals, because it's rare to see these animals, and so many people who frequent these waters can actually give us this kind of information. And avoid hunting the dugongs, because there are very few animals left. So maybe actively taking measures to try and see that dugongs are not hunted, and in have these areas where people don't put in nets, and they can avoid using nets. These are especially areas where dugongs feed on. So if nets can be avoided in these sites, so work with the community to inform them about how they can take these small steps by avoiding nets in dugong feeding grounds, and going slow in areas that the dugongs are feeding in, because the animal it can judge when or it kind of senses when animals are when a boat is coming at a particular speed. But if the speed is too high, then the animal cannot actually move down into deeper waters. So these are simple ways in which these steps can be taken to protect or to conserve the dugong and the seagrass habitats, especially for the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So finally, I would like to say is that most of what we know about dugongs, or even the conservation solutions or the research, the research approaches, is based on studies in the developed countries. One is where the funding is high, resources are very high, the animals are also larger in numbers, seagrass habitats also up vast in these areas. And I think at some point we need to, while we need to use that information as a basis of some of our research, in in lots of the developing countries, or in lots of areas around Southeast Asia, you have very similar conditions as we see in India, where you have small isolated pockets of dugongs. You have habitats that are similar. Some of the threats also and problems are similar. So we need to adapt our approach of research or of management to suit these particular areas. And rather than relying on a lot of technology or a lot of resources to start start the research or start the management. We need to find these intermediate solutions, or these low cost solutions that may be time consuming, that may take several years, but may give us a basic information that we actually need to conserve a species that is almost close to local extinction in several parts of India. So we need to take these steps quickly and use local solutions or local methods that we can adapt to our areas, and make that start. And it's only then that we can actually stop this animal from reaching local extinction in areas where in several areas across India. So with that, I would like to thank this really large team that has been involved in this research over the years, because it has not been possible to do it single-handedly. And there have been several people who have come in over the years and helped in various parts of this research. And all our funding agencies, especially the Department of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in Port Blair, who've been supporting a lot of this work, the Andaman and Nicobar administration, the Andaman and Nicobar environmental team, the tribal councils in the Nicobar Islands, and these funding agencies. With that, thank you so much for listening, and I can take questions.
Thank you, Alrika, for a wonderful presentation and taking us to the world of dugongs in the islands. And we were very excited to see your presentation, since we have been to the islands and we have seen how pristine are those areas from the human impact. And you are, I think, you're right in saying that we need local solutions for the archipelagos, because the conditions there are different and the impacts there are different. We have people asking you questions. I'll be taking the first question, which is asked by Abhijit. He's asking, what will be the impact on ecosystem of dugong getting extinct? So if the dugongs get extinct, what will be the impact on the marine ecosystems or the seagrass ecosystems, and to what extent?
Okay, so like I was also saying earlier, but maybe it wasn't very clear. So with their feeding, with the kind of feeding that dugongs engage in, they act like these gardeners. Okay, so they are constantly cropping or picking up these seagrasses and allowing fresh seagrass high in nutrients to actually grow in these areas. So what has been seen in several areas where, or in areas where there is no active herbivory or no active clipping by these dugongs, is that these the seagrasses lead to these they kind of get older, their nutrient content reduces, and they reach a stage called a die-off stage, where you have very poor quality seagrasses in this particular area. So that could be one of the things that could happen to the ecosystem. And the other, which could be a longer term change, would be that since dugongs actually they feed on these seagrasses that are what we call the early successional seagrasses. So if you have barren sandy bottoms, the first colonizers, so the first ones to come there, are the same seagrasses that the dugongs feed on. And then eventually they're taken over by the later successions, which also happen to be the seagrasses that are thicker, high in fiber, not preferred by dugongs and lots of other vertebrates and invertebrates. So we might eventually see this, this succession happening from the early succession to late successional species. So these are the kind of impacts that one could see in without the dugong. But one must also remember that there are also other herbivores in this system. So if one has to study this, you need to also see if the dugong is absent in the particular area, you might also have the impact of other herbivores on those seagrasses. So so if you to actually pinpoint that this is the effect of the dugong or other herbivores, you need to be careful about pointing that out.
Okay, thanks for a great answer. And Dipani has commented upon your presentation, and she has said that when do we get back to the field? I think very soon, Dipani. And Regan is asking, do the dugongs eat different types of grasses in different seasons? or at different ages, whether juvenile, adult, and pregnant females eat different seagrasses in different seasons? Is it kind of a pattern that you're seeing?
Different seasons and at different ages, no?
Yes.
So what we've been seeing is that the dugongs are eating the same seagrasses, and but like so they prefer these short-lived small seagrasses only because they're maximizing on the energy and the nutrients that they're taking in. So in seagrasses also, we've been looking at the seasonal changes in seagrasses, and we do see these peaks in production. So you have the summers being the peak production, where you'll have lots high biomass in seagrasses, whereas close to the monsoons, or in the monsoons and in the winters, the production goes a little low. And so although there are these differences, the dugongs are still feeding on these same species of seagrasses. But like I said, at times we've noticed that when, say, the close by meadows with these preferred species have got destroyed by cyclones, which are quite common in Andamans, we do see dugongs feeding in these later successional species, like say Cymodosia is one of them that we do see a few, but very few, like one or two feeding trails. So this has been seen when the meadows have been destroyed, and I think on one occasion we have seen it even though the meadow has been there. But like I said, it's just this one of feeding trails. So I don't know if the dugong has these preferences for fiber at some time in their diet as well. That part I'm not sure of, but these are the kind of choices they make. Have I answered, because I can't see the question again? Were there other parts to that question? Oh, okay. You've asked that are they different stages? I don't know. I don't think so, because whatever I've read of and know of, they all feed on the same seagrasses. Okay, so should I go to the next question?
Alka, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. So the question, follow-up question to that is, does their excrement also help in adding back nitrogen to grasses?
It does. I guess this might, be more relevant in areas where you have these large herds and there's a substantial quantity of the excreta going into the system. But there are several other, when you have such few individuals, I don't think it makes that much of a difference as opposed to other sources of nitrogen for that system.
Okay, Alrika, Ganesh is asking, what is the relationship between dugongs and mangroves? Is it symbiosis between them? How are dugongs affected by presence of mangroves and nutrient supply by the mangroves?
So I don't know if there's any relationship between dugongs and mangroves, but there's definitely relationships between mangroves and seagrasses in terms of the nutrient flowing through these systems, because lots of seagrass meadows are either in mangrove areas or close to mangrove areas. So you will have a nutrient flow in these systems, and the dugongs, if their habitats are close to mangrove areas, then you may have dugongs also seen close to mangrove areas. So there is no symbiosis between them as such, but this is the closest relationships I can see between the dugong, it's the seagrass habitats, and mangroves.
Okay, Alrika, we have one more question coming from Soham. It is, what will be the challenges for carrying out long-term temporal assessment of seagrass beds in remote regions like Andamans? Do we have well-documented distribution data of previous years?
So we've been looking at these monitoring these seagrass, some of the seagrass meadows since 2010. So what we do is that every 4 years we've been doing this systematic archipelago-wide survey. In fact, this time we were supposed to do one of that as well, where we have been looking at these changes in seagrasses. And the challenges in doing this, as in we have been doing it systematically, but one is the area is really vast to cover for doing these in-water surveys, looking at whether the seagrass is present there, looking at species composition. So the areas are large. The conditions are not very conducive for these for doing this research, because a lot of these areas very difficult to access at all times of the year. So you need to find that particular fair period to be doing these surveys. And just also the threats by say some of these sites are very close to uh, uh, mangrove areas where you have crocodiles in these areas, so you don't actually want to go into these sites and look for seagrasses. But there may be solutions to these, like putting down cameras, but we need to be cautious with what solutions we're using based on each of these sites, because we'll have to look at visibility, you'll have to look at currents and things like that. So like I said, we have these distribution data. So the earliest surveys were actually conducted by SACON in 1996, and after that we have surveys of 3 years, 3 different time scales now. And we have seen changes from say the surveys that were done in 2010 and the ones that were done in 15. And these changes were like in 2010, there were meadows that were still recovering from the tsunami of 2004. And then, so we had few seagrass meadows that we documented then. And then again, when we did the survey, we actually seen these seagrass meadows recovering and the number of seagrass meadows being much higher. I think I've answered that question. I can go to the next.
Yes, Elrika. The next question to you is by Pradeep. What is the behavioral and ecological change you observe when some member from a dugong group dies who feed in the same area? So if there is any dugong which is dying over, and what will happen to that particular area? So I think he's asking about seagrass habitat in that area.
When some member die from a group?
Yes.
So is he I guess you're referring to what is the behavioral change in the animal and then the ecological change?
Yeah, behavioral change, I think, in the dugong herd, and
okay.
if there is a herd.
Yeah. So like I said, we've not seen herds. I personally have just seen 2 individuals together, and mostly I've seen just two animals together, and mostly I've seen just individuals around. And I have not, while I do have seen dead animals, but I have not seen animals of a particular pair dying. So I don't know what could be the behavioral change, because I have not observed it. And the ecological change, I have not seen ecological changes yet in the sites where the animals were there earlier, and right now maybe it's something I will probably see in the next few years, because it's not that many mortalities that have been recorded in the years that we've been doing this study.
Okay, thanks, Elrika. There's another question that has been asked by Soham is the habitat suitability that you have conducted is impressive. That's a compliment for your presentation and work. And how to conduct such study on a large spatial scale with limited data availability? And how do you prove the predictors of your model as independent of each other? So this is the question. I think you can see the.
So how would I do it at these large spatial scales? Like I said, one is it takes a lot of time. So what we did is we conducted these at different times. So the Andaman was done separately, the Nicobar was done separately, and we tried and tried and conducted these surveys in areas where at a period where there was like peak production. So one is we were sure of finding seagrasses and finding seagrasses during their peak production time. So then we would avoid the fact that the animals could be avoiding the site just because seagrasses weren't available. And I think when there is limited data, what can be done is pull in all these different kind of data that are available, because lots of limited data together makes I think can be substantial data in itself. And that is the kind of approach actually we use. I think at the start of the study also, we weren't sure what are the approach that we can take initially, and we modified some of these approaches over time based on what we were seeing. As it's not always that you can expect some of these, and whether these variables are not independent of each other. In fact, they are dependent. They're quite dependent to each other, and hence you cannot just keep one variable and say that this one is more important than the other. I think together they're all interdependent, and that's what can lead to this understanding habitat suitability. I'll go to the next question.
Yes, Elrika. It is by Regan. At what depth do they usually feed and the grasses grow? Also, what have they been hunted for usually or traditionally?
So we've seen in Andamans, so seagrass meadows can be found right from the intertidal area up to depths of sometimes they have been even reported to at depths of I think 20 meters. So in Andamans, we've seen seagrasses at 18 meters, 18 and even 19 meters with feeding grounds, with feeding signs. So dugongs have been feeding in those areas. And what have they been hunted for? So they've been hunted for meat, because apparently the meat is supposed to be quite tasty, is what lots of the people, some of the people in the islands say as well. And traditionally, so dugongs have these, cultural values in some of the tribes, for some of the tribes in the Andamans. Say, for example, the Ongis, they used to hunt dugongs. They have a whole a method by which they actually go and hunt. So they used to hunt dugongs, and they used to keep the skull and some of the bones. They used to paint it and keep them in their house, and it used to apparently bring a luck to the home, and for the family of the hunter as well, for his future huntings. And I think, and with the great Andamanese, in fact, some of them also said that they thought that the hunting of dugongs actually brought prosperity to their community. And now, because they have not been able to hunt the dugong, their community is dwindling. Okay, so I have answered that one, hopefully.
Yes, Elrika. The last question for you from our Zoom meeting attendees is from Chinmaya. She asks, do dugongs use other marine habitats actively, such as corals or rocky patches, other than seagrass meadows?
So, in fact, I think there was recently a paper that talked about the time dugongs are spending in other habitats, also like coral reefs. I don't have it right now, but you can just Google it and look at it. And what I have seen is that, so dugongs are not always feeding. There are times where they do something called idling, where they're just like moving aimlessly in the water, and they're very close to the surface so that they can come up to breed. So in fact, we have a video also where where the dugong is just moving or idling in the coral reef that was adjacent to the seagrass meadow. So it spent almost some 4 or 5 hours in this area, just doing nothing, just moving around. So they do spend time in other areas as well. Like I said, the only one study that I know has documented this kind of kind of time spent, but mostly they spend it in seagrass meadows, because they need to feed on a lot of seagrasses. They require almost 30 kgs of seagrasses every day. So they spend most of the time in seagrasses and some time outside as well.
Thanks, Elrika. There's a compliment for you from Regan. He says, thanks a lot. Very interesting session. And as you know, we are also broadcasting it on our YouTube channel, on Wildlife Institute of India's YouTube channel. There are two questions from there. People watching us on YouTube. Vishruta is asking, do dugongs have a breeding season?
I'm not sure they have a breeding season, but what happens is they do form these leks where, at least in where there are larger herds, where you have these big herds coming together, and you have a few females moving around. Sorry, a few males moving around females. So that kind of uh, breeding has been observed in Australia, but they have not mentioned of any season. And even in Andaman, there was one report where people, one video in fact showing a dugong attempting to mate, but there have been no records of it being a seasonal thing. So either there's no information, I'm not very sure of this, but as far as I know, there's no season as such.
Okay, we have a question for you from Rohit. He says, lovely presentation, Elrika. The multi-zonal, multi-level protection scheme you offer is both interesting and inclusive. Has it been implemented anywhere in the islands? If yes, what are the outcomes? If no, what are the reasons?
So this is something that is wherein we've been trying to implement this. So it's not something that is that we have tested the outcomes as yet, because this was something that was supposed to be done in the last year and now. So hopefully in this year, when we get back to field, we can try implementing some of this, and in a few years monitor these changes and see if they are actually working. But with respect to some of them, actually, like, just about awareness. So we had kind of piloted this in 2 islands in in the Riches archipelago, to see how people were responding to it. We didn't actually put out anything, but just talks to people. And I think a lot of what was actually working is that, including the people and making them part of this approach, where they also see benefits in it. So maybe that is one thing that will be used to implement this approach. And hopefully I think in a few years from now, maybe 2 or 3 years, if we start implementing it sometime next year, then in a few years we'll be able to see the impacts of it.
Thank you, Elrika. And I have just one last question for you from Ankita. She asks, how does the presence of phytoplanktons impact the clarity of water in order to observe seagrass through satellite images? So this is something not exactly related to your field of work, but still, I think you can answer this. That how does presence of phytoplanktons might affect the clarity of satellite
Yeah.
observing seagrasses through satellite images?
Mm. So, in fact, I would say that observing seagrasses through satellite imagery is not at all easy. So, it works well for intertidal meadows, and when you get these signatures during low tides. So, there have been institutes in Tamil Nadu who've been looking at this, and they have also raised their concern about how difficult it is to map seagrasses using satellite imagery. So, anything that is submerged is not easy to get signatures from, because there is a lot of noise in the form of either, like you said, phytoplanktons, or sometimes the reef or algae. In algae, in most cases, so it's very difficult to actually look at these uh, to distinguish seagrasses through satellite imagery. It works for, I'm not saying it does not work, it does work for these intertidal, really shallow seagrasses, but once you get into a meter or two depth, it is very difficult. So phytoplanktons definitely will affect these the signatures that you get. But also it depends on when these phytoplankton blooms are. So usually if you have a bloom in a phytoplankton bloom, then that might affect. So you can affect the signatures. But if you have data before the bloom or after the bloom, I'm guessing you may get some signatures from that.
Okay, thank you, Elrika. I think
Thank you so
we are
much.
done with all the questions. You have answered almost all the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, you
And it
can.
was a very informative session. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, please, you were saying.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can always write to me at
Yeah.
elrica@ncf.
And you can send the mail to us as well. We'll forward the mail to all the speakers of the current session as well as past sessions. And
Okay.
Dr. Elrika will be joining us tomorrow as well for the panel discussion, and where we'll be discussing more about marine mammal conservation in India. Thank you, Elrika. Thanks for your time.
Yep. Thank you so
Bye
much.
bye.
Bye.